So I think there is something awe-inspiring about hiking up through a forest and up along a mountain to get to a place where you can hold an image of a relative from 500 million years ago, and to not just hold one, but to get to walk over a whole family photo album. And that is an experience that you can have in a handful of fossil quarries in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, known as the Burgess Shale. I am studying power relationships between paleontologists and other groups around the Burgess Shale in Yoho National Park in Canada during the 20th century. Science writer Stephen Jay Gould once called the marine organisms there the world's most important animal fossils because of how much they've helped us understand the diversity of early life. And I'm trying to understand how science negotiated access to these sites and helped influence what was allowed there. I began my research inspired by Ramachandra Guha and Harriet Ripo's research into the power that biologists have exerted to claim land and exclude others from parks. And given the themes of this week's conference, today I want to put the Burgess Shale in context with two other fossil sites in Canada, Dinosaur Provincial Park and the Joggins Fossil Cliffs, all of which became natural World Heritage Sites, and my goal is to reframe the idea of natural in these places. So let's begin with the Burgess Shale. Today the term refers to a constellation of sites throughout Yoho and Kootenay National Parks, but I'm going to focus on the two sites in Yoho that scientists had identified at the time of the World Heritage Site designation. So this is a map of what eventually became the Canadian Rocky Mountain Parks World Heritage Site. So you might be familiar with Banff or Jasper, and Yoho National Park is here, and the Burgess Shale sites are just here on either side of that road there. So those two sites are the Mount Stephen trilobite beds and the Walcott Quarry. If you visit these sites, you will step over shattered chunks of shale with impressions of trilobites and anomalocaris claws, and if you're lucky, other flattened, squished, small marine creatures. They are remnants of life after the Cambrian explosion around 500 million years ago, when complex multicellular life suddenly started experimenting with movement and eyesight and building legs and claws and gills. The advent, says Stephen Jay Gould, of virtually all major groups of animals. And if you're curious what those kind of look like, I actually brought some models. The Royal Ontario Museum makes these very cool toys of some of the species that you can find there. So thank you very much for helping me pass these out. If you want to just see some of the cool things.
Thank you.
He's over here.
So among indigenous groups in this region, Tunaha, Stoney, and Chukwepan traditional territory extends through Yoho National Park. So it seems likely that people from these groups observed some of the Burgess Shale fossils long before settlers arrived in the area. There is a long history of indigenous peoples in Canada being excluded from national parks, and one example of that here is that in 1884, 2 years before Yoho was created, British Columbia Indian Reserve Commissioner Peter O'Reilly assigned Tunaha people reserves intentionally far to the south of the present-day park. He was given orders to make sure the reserves were smaller than the ones east of the Rockies, and also to clear land for white settlers who might be attracted by the new railway. The first settlers to notice Cambrian fossils in the Burgess Shale were surveyors and railway workers who were helping develop the town of Field and the Canadian Pacific Railway line here in the 1880s. Reports of the trilobite beds on Mount Stephen attracted Charles Doolittle Walcott, an American geologist and a secretary with the Smithsonian Institution, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, which is the director. The new railway allowed Walcott, his family, and a team of assistants to come to Yoho to find more fossils, and in 1909 and 1910, they identified what we now call the Walcott Quarry. And over the next decade, they dug and dynamited to get to those fossils, and here you can see a photograph which Walcott published in the Canadian Alpine Journal in 1908 of the other site, the Mount Stephen trilobite beds. So nowadays, Parks Canada does not allow you to ride horses or camp overnight or remove fossils or even access this site without a research permit or a guide. And I love this photograph because it shows the railway on one side, the fossil beds, and a recommended route to ride your horses up and camp overnight. In Walcott's time, wilderness in Canadian mountain parks was a space where an American scientist could do all these things because, frankly, our Parks Agency's model of wilderness was geared towards creating experiences of rugged solitude and physical challenge for wealthy people. Walcott didn't have time to do exhaustive studies of the fossils, just quick descriptions in most cases, and he believed that most of the animals that he saw fit into modern groups. In the 1960s, the Geological Survey of Canada and Cambridge University's Harry Whittington led a survey here collecting more fossils, and a picture began to emerge suggesting that life in the Cambrian was far more different and strange than modern-day fauna than had previously been imagined. In brief, basically, the complexity of these organisms put into question the idea that life on Earth started really simple and then got more complex and advanced over time. the Royal Ontario Museum led another major collecting program here in the mid-1970s. And so when Canada was drawing up its first nominations to the World Heritage List, the Burgess Shale was a site of both recent excavation and active scientific research. The main character of the Burgess Shale's nomination was this guy with these fantastic glasses, Peter H. Bennett, an advisor to the Parks Canada Assistant Deputy Minister. Basically, Peter Bennett's job was to travel around Canada and identify sites and monuments to nominate. His record of community consultation seems mixed. On the west coast of Canada, he worked together with the Haida Gwaii Watchman Program and the Skidegate Band Council on the nomination of the Skangwai Island World Heritage Site with totem poles and mortuary sites. On the other hand, when Wood Buffalo Park in northern Alberta was designated as a World Heritage Site, local Indigenous groups said they didn't even know it was nominated, and the federal environment minister was so out of the loop that he approved more commercial logging in the park before he realized it had been nominated. Most of the nominations that Peter Bennett developed were natural heritage proposals. Parks Canada published a magazine called Conservation Canada, and in 1978, Bennett contributed an article about the World Heritage Convention, and in it, he says that Canada is unlikely to get many properties on the list. Of those that are accepted, most will probably be natural sites. The difficulty in nominating Canadian cultural sites is always likely to be justifying them as of outstanding universal value and not just of national significance. Another insecurity that worked in favor of the Burgess Shale's nomination was that in 1979, Parks Canada representatives were debating nominating just these little fossil sites or the entire Rocky Mountain Park area, including all of Yoho, the 3 adjacent federal parks, and a whole bunch of other wilderness areas in Alberta and BC as buffer zones. The director of the Western Region Office of Parks Canada was in favor of nominating this whole mountain park system, but a staffer told him that Bennett and his advisors dismissed that idea because the proposal would not stand up as being more significant in the mountain ranges of the world than some others, which I find hilarious because that is almost the exact boundaries that became a World Heritage Site later. But in 1979, they thought, didn't have a good chance, maybe we try something smaller. Before the World Heritage designation, the Burgess Shale sites don't seem to have been a major draw to Yoho. They occasionally pop up in tourist brochures. It was illegal to remove any fossils in a national park, but there was no need to get a permit to hike in the area. After the designation in 1980, Parks Canada staff started to feel that this open access wasn't feasible anymore. A Calgary Herald article in 1982 mentioned that according to the chief warden, the number of visitors and potential thieves to the fossil beds has nearly doubled since the publicity that accompanied their designation as a United Nations World Heritage Site. The chief warden, Gordon Rutherford, he said, "We don't want to cut the public off from the fossil beds, but we are concerned about their protection." And I'm fascinated by how ad hoc the next steps seemed, where site restrictions seemed to emerge. Randall Robertson was a warden in Yoho in the 1970s and 80s, and according to him, he was the one that suggested to the chief warden and the superintendent that it was time to close off these areas to anyone without a permit. Wardens could, and they did, search visitors' backpacks for fossils if they were doing something fishy, maybe on a mountain. But Robertson said the parks managers thought it detracted from the ideas of parks as a place for people to go to have fun. And they didn't have enough staff to monitor this new volume of tourists either. So according to Robertson, he drew up maps of areas that he thought should be restricted around the Walcott Quarry and the Mount Stephen fossil beds, and he got the superintendent to sign off on them. And this is how a system emerged where members of the public can only visit these sites with a permit or on a paid interpretive hike. Parks Canada was not as prepared for visitor traffic as Peter Bennett had hoped, and individual staff on the ground thought this was the only practical way to cut down on fossil theft. In 1984, the Burgess Shale became a part of the new Canadian Rocky Mountain Park site, but the restrictions have stayed as a legacy, even though many, many more fossil sites have been identified outside these zones in Yoho and the adjacent park, Kootenay, which are not subject to the same restrictions. So Todd Keith is a current Parks Canada land use manager for Yoho, Kootenay, and Lake Louise, another site nearby. He says there are trade-offs to these site restrictions. It puts a burden on their staff to maintain the closures and communicate them to the public, and it limits visitors' freedom to engage with this landscape on their own terms. But he says the restrictions are necessary because enforcement is so tough for park staff trying to prevent fossil theft. Keith says part of the scientific value of these fossils is where they are in the rock, literally which layers are on top of what, and removing fossils destroys that value, which is part of why they also don't allow scientists to use dynamite there anymore, because it blows everything away. And you get all your layers mixed up. But he also told me that the experience that I had of being in awe of stepping all over these trilobite fossils is part of what they're trying to protect too. I've heard a Parks Canada interpreter and Todd Keith tell me the same story about this little animal here, Ovadio vermis cribatus, in defense of the system. So back in 2011, a visitor on one of the guided hikes picked up a rock and saw, although this looks huge here, it's actually like a thumb-sized fossil, and it looked kind of like a smushed shrimp to this visitor, and the interpreter brought it down to the Parks Canada office in town, and at the end of that season, Todd Keith showed it to a paleontologist from the Royal Ontario Museum, Jean-Bernard Caron, and Caron was blown away because he had just submitted a paper describing a new species found in the Walcott Quarry from one specimen, and this was the second. So natural heritage sites are rare on the World Heritage List, and places recognized for their geological or paleontology values are even more rare. In 1996, Australian paleontologist Roderick Wells wrote a framework for evaluating new World Heritage List candidate sites, focusing on geological history. And he said that sites should be selected based on their significance in telling the story of evolution. And he pointed specifically to the Burgess Shale as a significant site for telling the story of the Cambrian explosion. Not every fossil bed gets any legal protection. They're under threat from construction and vandalism and industrial pressure all around the world. The International Paleontological Association's Paleoparks Initiative has helped build a database of protected fossil sites and sites at risk around the world. They list Israel and Mexico as among the countries with the strongest laws against disturbing any fossil site. They praise the European and UNESCO geoparks programs, and they've identified endangered sites like there's a Miocene forest in Hungary whose trees are were under threat at the time from mining and exposure to the air. Some of them are in a museum now. The fact that harvesting the Burgess Shale fossils was regulated and that many of them can still be seen in context on a hike is rare, and that happened largely because they were in a national park. The province they were in, British Columbia, didn't even have legislation regarding fossils until 2018. So this is the second site we're going to look at, Dinosaur Provincial Park in my home province of Alberta, just east of British Columbia. It's a very different kind of fossil site. It's on Niitsitapi, Stoney, Métis, Anochite, Sakowin territory. It made it into the World Heritage List 1 year before the Burgess Shale in 1979. And here you can picture tyrannosaurs and duck-billed dinosaurs and nodosaurs with spikes and plates of armor. The fossils here date back to the Cretaceous, around 75 million years ago. And today the landscape is a mix of grasslands and what we call badlands in southern Alberta. It's a dry, hilly ecosystem. It's super easily eroded by wind and rain. And research teams run field expeditions here most summers. It's a major tourist attraction. Access to most of the backcountry is forbidden to the general public, but there are campsites and a small visitor center and interpretation programs that let you join in guided hikes to see the fossils for yourself. The Alberta government worked with Peter Bennett and his ministry to help write this proposal and to delineate a core area free of minerals, which fully represents the park's unique features. This provincial support likely pushed it to the top of Canada's priority list, along with the fact that it was not the center of Indigenous land claims and was already protected by park boundaries. The IUCN agreed that the site had outstanding universal value, in part because it's unmatched in terms of the number and variety of high-quality specimens, Cretaceous species. Its exceptional natural beauty was another factor, although it was described in a way that reinforced this idea of an undisturbed wilderness that erased Indigenous presence from the park story. And finally, the IUCN was convinced that the site's integrity would be protected. The site's integrity would be protected by the size of the protected area and the fact that Alberta had an Alberta Historical Resources Act of 1978, which regulated collecting fossils elsewhere in the province. Basically what it shows is that UNESCO World Heritage designation itself doesn't give protection of heritage resources necessarily, but the prestige of programs like it can reward and create incentives for states that do so. So it might sound strange, but there's a seasonal rhythm to collecting fossils in Dinosaur Provincial Park. Paleontologists wait until after the snow melts to begin summer field seasons, and any rain can make it treacherous to hike because the slopes are largely made of bentonite clay, which is basically toothpaste. Frost thaw cycles and erosion here can uncover new specimens every year, and they can also destroy exposed specimens really easily. So paleontologists have used that cycle of erosion to justify regular collecting programs. If they don't pick it up, maybe it gets washed away by the next year. Before Alberta's Historical Resources Act, jurisdiction over rights to collect and remove fossils was more contested. After the foundation of the park, its managers insisted that any fossils collected should remain there, but in one particularly contentious incident in 1969, a University of Alberta paleontologist named Richard Fox removed a whole specimen of a Centrosaurus without parks officials' knowledge or consent, to their great displeasure, and relationships are less contentious now. So the final site I just want to show you is the Joggins fossil cliffs in Nova Scotia. This is on the Atlantic coast of Canada. The name comes from a Mi'kmaq word for the place, Joggins. It was inscribed in 2008, and the senior author of the nomination was a geoheritage researcher. These cliffs preserve the remains of ancient forests and the oldest known reptiles in the world. It's a slice of Pennsylvania or late Carboniferous time period from around 310 million years ago. The cliffs are part of the Bay of Fundy coastline with tides that rise between 12 and 16 meters. Does anybody here live by the coast? Does that seem like an astonishing amount of tidal variation to you? It's huge. Hiking out here last summer with our friends and their dog was really fascinating for me because I've lived most of my life on the prairies. I'm not used to thinking of the rhythm of tides at all, but our guide kept pointing out how much more the beach was exposed just as we were walking along it. Just these couple hours we were there. And these intense tides are part of the reason that new fossils are constantly emerging at Joggins, because the waves are constantly ripping away at the cliffs. So we could see a fossil tree trunk embedded halfway up the cliff, and also we could see more around us that had shattered out of the rocks. The fossil and coal layers here were studied by Charles Lyell, a famous founder of modern geology. They were used as evidence in the first debates on evolution, and they were cited in Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Local and provincial laws prohibit construction and mineral exploitation and land uses that might interfere with the erosion process or the aesthetic qualities along the shoreline. And Nova Scotia's Special Places Protection Act only allows fossil collection by scientists with a heritage research permit. So if you're a member of the public, you can't collect common loose fossils like you could at maybe, there's a World Heritage Site in the UK, in Dorset and East Devon coast, where you could pick up something fairly common on the beach and take it home. I think this is one of the most interesting absurdities of this site as it's managed today, because you're welcome to walk down to the beach on your own. So there is an understandable risk of people removing important and unusual fossils, but twice a day, the Bay of Fundy tears all of the exposed rocks into the water anyway. Like this was just two pictures we took at the beginning and end of our hike, and you can see how much the water's receded. So there are a few important consequences designating these three places as natural heritage sites. The IUCN got to evaluate their nominations, which meant they had a receptive audience for the site's geological values. The official who reviewed the Burgess Shale application, for example, was a Parks Canada official on loan to the IUCN. It was named Hal Eidsvik, and he endorsed the nomination based on phone calls to museums and universities, the idea that the Burgess Shale was very nearly in its natural state, and also articles written by geologists and paleontologists. By entering the orbit of park systems and the World Heritage List, these sites have become engulfed in the discourses of heritage and wilderness. Laura Jane Smith has argued that heritage is not an innate property of a place, it's a discourse and a cultural practice that promotes a certain set of Western elite cultural values as being universally applicable. And similarly, Phillip and April Vannini argued that wildness is not an innate property, but an emergent outcome of activity, of performance, of inhabitation. We do heritage, basically, we do wildness. By dipping these sites into these discourses, we've altered what things we can do that are considered permissible. For scientists, that means there's more restrictions on collecting methods, and for the public, there's much tighter restrictions on access and taking fossils home, plus more surveillance. You're literally being watched by camera if you go into these sites. Vincent Santucci.
We still have time to finish.
Awesome. Vincent Santucci, Peter Newman, and Derek Taff have identified a whole range of values that humans place on fossils. There's scientific values, educational, recreational, spiritual, commercial, even aesthetic values. The fact that they're non-renewable is part of what gives them value both for scientists and for commercial interests. Fossils can reinforce identity, like through designating a provincial fossil. People can feel aesthetically drawn to beauty and color and symmetry. They can have recreational value as a destination for a family vacation. They can be part of spiritual ceremonies and beliefs. One fun thing I learned at Joggins is that it's really common to find this type of root here from a plant called stigmaria. So these roots are like as thick as your forearm, and our guide told us it used to be so common for people to take them home that locals called them Joggins doorstops. In all three of these places, a major reason for the nomination was a history of important scientific discoveries. These are also sites that have inspired art, that people love to hike along, and that amateurs feel drawn to collect from. And these are all, I would argue, cultural practices. In all these places, wildness is not something that's just there, but something that's culturally constructed. And by seeing that any definition of wilderness is a cultural construction, we can look more strangely maybe at our choices and see if they're appropriate. Wildness at these sites seems to be a performance of scientific research, and tightly regulated interpretive hikes. Is there room to recognize them as part of indigenous cultural landscapes too? Is there space for more amateur collecting or doorstops at a fossil site that makes it onto the World Heritage List? If not, what are the consequences for people already alienated from nature who need so many more points of contact with wild things and the living world? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. You made it right on time.